Welcome to Green Signals, your railway podcast with me, Nigel Harris, here in Lincolnshire, and
me, Richard Bowker, here in Derbyshire.
Well, we got a fascinating week this week. It's been all action. The hottest topic of the lot is the abandonment of the ticket office closure proposals by the government this very morning, not 6 hours ago. So, of course, we're going to be looking at that in some detail. And this is largely thanks to a brave and principled landmark report drawn up by Transport Focus, led by Anthony Smith, following the consultation, which attracted 750,000 or so responses, which I understand is the biggest response to a public consultation ever into anything. And one wonders how much money this has cost, because it's been a pretty half-baked plan. There's probably a discussion to be had as to who first uttered the words, "We could look at ticket offices to secure some savings." But the fact remains that the plans that were drawn up were gone over with a fine-tooth comb by the government, who approved all of it. Which means that to suggest now, as has been the case, that this was all down to the railway is a bit rich and at best disingenuous. The words that Secretary of State Mark Harper used this morning, you shouldn't be taken in by him, really. He said he'd asked train operators to withdraw their proposals because they failed to meet high passenger standards. Incredibly, he added, the government had made it clear to the rail industry throughout the process that any resulting proposals should meet a high threshold of serving passengers. Well, given that we've established it knew what was coming, that is mischievous, putting it at its best. And then to say that the proposals, another quote, these proposals do not meet the high thresholds set by ministers, and so the government has asked train operators to withdraw them, is effectively throwing the rail industry under a bus for proposals which it fully signed off to and knew what was coming. And I say it gives new meaning to the word disingenuous. God knows how many more wasted millions of pounds of taxpayers' money have been swilled away in this. But it is hardly surprising that the train operating companies are said to be incandescent with anger about being thrown under the bus, or rather the train in this instance, by the Secretary of State. As recently as September the 10th, the Prime Minister unleashed his latest salvo of anti-rail surface-to-air BS, hashtag RSBS, when he told the Standard, and this is a direct quote, that closing railway ticket offices is the right thing for the British public. Although in a spectacularly hypocritical postscript, he also said it wouldn't be right for me to preempt the response or what the conclusions are, having done just that. And I struggle to find the words to articulate my contempt for this brazen attitude by government towards the railways, which is all about cost. Passengers don't matter, revenues don't matter. All they care about is cutting costs. And, of course, that's just a function of the fact that all the money goes to the Treasury, whereas the DfT is responsible for costs. So that is all it cares about. Thankfully, hooray, the British public had a rather different idea of what was the right thing for them, and 750,000 of them made their feelings clear to Transport Focus in this massive response. So let's hear it for TF and Chief Exec Anthony Smith, who announced this morning with devastating simplicity that Transport Focus is objecting to all of the current proposals to close ticket offices. TF added that the responses had contained powerful and passionate concerns, and that all the train operators had failed to meet the criteria set by TF for the ticket office closures. All of them. Now, given that the government had been over that in fine detail, is further instance of a slippery approach by government to this very thing. So, let's move straight on to today's show. Now, later on, we've got a bit of fun stuff and some lighter-hearted material to round things off. but let's get into the really serious stuff first of all. Fares and ticketing is our first really deep dive, and we're in for a real treat. We are beyond delighted that we're joined by Mark Smith, renowned throughout the railway as the man in seat 61. Now, you may not know this, but Mark is not only a former station manager of considerable experience, but also a former DfT civil servant, and he has unrivaled knowledge of the railway network, not only in the UK, but right around Europe. If you're travelling by train around Europe, you could do far worse than start with Mark's site to put your itinerary together. Now, Mark is without doubt the expert's expert on this. He is our go-to guy when it comes to fares and ticketing, and so we're going to devote most of today's show to understanding exactly what's going on with our labyrinthine fare system. That's a good word, isn't it, Richard? Labyrinthine. The consequences for the decision, the correct decision, to scrap the highly controversial proposals to close the thick end of 1,000 ticket offices in England, which 700,000 or so people issued a resounding no to government, said to be the biggest public response to any consultation on record. And that really speaks for itself and informs why the government has been pushed into this decision, this U-turn, an expression that they hate. What on earth do we do next? So, to start to answer that question, and without further ado, another good word, ado, let's welcome Mark Smith to Green Signals. Welcome, Mark. Looking forward to hearing what you've got to say, my friend. I know I always learn something when you start to speak, which is good stuff. But look, just before we get into it, can I just ask? I've meant to ask you this for so long. Why the man in seat 61? There must be a story there.
Well, when I set off from London to somewhere special, sort of the Crimea via Kiev or to Japan via Moscow and Vladivostok, I would treat myself to Eurostar first class, and none of us like getting a seat with a pillar next to us, a piece of wall next to us, do we? So I looked at the seating plan and made sure I chose the right first class seat, seat 61, coach 7, 8, 11 or 12 in the original Eurostars. That ticked all the boxes.
Well, I've got two things to say about that. One is, what was it, Kiev to Crimea via where? It bit different to your Chorley to Manchester Victoria, Richard.
Well, I picked the right moment for visiting Crimea. Yes, so Berlin,
well,
Warsaw,
indeed.
Kiev, and Sebastopol.
Wow. But I share your views entirely about ending up in a seat next to a wall or a pillar, particularly on the Pendolinos. Maybe we ought to talk to whoever specified them sometime and give him a bit of a flea in his ear about that.
Yeah, we probably should. I think I'll find out who it is. We'll have a jolly good word, okay?
Okay, absolutely right. So, there we go. Scene set.
So, first question, actually, I'm going to kick off with this. It's okay, Mark. I mean, you've seen what's happened today. What's your kind of immediate reaction? I mean, what we're looking at here, the right decision?
Well, apart from the obvious relief that they're not going to push through with it, this was one of the two outcomes that I expected. I knew that from past experience that ticket offices and staffing are a very emotive issue, and this was going to kick up a storm, and it did, of course. So it was a sort of 50-50 toss-up whether this administration were going to push through with it in destructive mode, or whether they were going to do a U-turn. So for me, this has always been on the cards, and I'm just relieved that they've gone with the U-turn option rather than the destructive one of pushing through with his, as Nigel says, very half-baked scheme.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But just being a bit, let's just be fair on the policy proposal for a minute, which I know might sound a bit counterintuitive. But if you're sort of taking a step back, you go, actually, do you know what? Pre-privatisation, so we're going back over, obviously, 25 years plus now. It was simpler, it was clearer, it was more understandable. It's all got more complicated since privatisation. So maybe there was a point to this, or are we talking about the wrong issue with that?
It has got more complicated, meaning the structure of the industry, meaning fares, meaning ticketing. It certainly has, with 20 different operators all following different or slightly different policies. So if you look at what's happened to the way people buy tickets, there has been a seismic change in the way people do that. And yes, there has been a huge reduction in the proportion of tickets bought at a ticket office. So it's not unreasonable to want to adjust that, but not this way. If we were doing this sensibly, the first thing we would do is create a BR 2.0, call it a strategic rail authority, if you like, something to sit in the middle, take control of the industry at arm's length from government, bring together revenue and cost, and run the rail industry like a business. And one of the first things they should do is reform fares. You do that before you look at ticket office provision, because so much demand is driven to ticket offices by the complexity. If people don't understand what they're seeing on a website, they're going to ask someone in a ticket office, or they don't understand on a machine.
But some of that complexity is kind of the way we buy stuff now. Anyway, one thing that's always struck me as a bit odd is if you fly to somewhere like, I don't know, Verona or something like that, if you book 6 months in advance, it'll cost you a fiver. If you go tomorrow morning, it might cost you 300 quid. And so two people could be sat on the plane next to each other, having paid vastly different prices. I mean, that's just what is often called yield management. It's actually making the most of the space you've got on the plane. We don't mind about that with airlines, but all of a sudden we seem to sort of have such an issue with it on the railways. But surely is it a good thing or a bad thing? It seems to me it's actually quite a good thing. I don't understand why people don't like it.
Well, on intercity routes, advance purchase fares, which do exactly what the airline advance purchase fares do, fill spare capacity at cheap prices, are a very welcome development. They're now mainstream fares, and they are a good thing. They wouldn't work on short distance in the same way, of course, but for intercity routes, they're undoubtedly a good thing. Now, the problem we've got with the fares at the moment, I mean, let's imagine you buy one of those yield managed cheap fares. Let's say you're going away for the weekend, you book the 1800 on a Friday, that's what you see online. There's a £30 advance fare, that's very good value. Then you go and look at your return journey on a Sunday afternoon. And let's say you don't know when you're going to come back, so you want an off-peak ticket, a flexible ticket that you can use on any train. Well, hang on, under the current railway fare structure, an off-peak return is often just £1 more than a one-way. So having chosen off-peak for the way back on your Sunday, you've now really got, financially, you're forced to pay the extra £1 and revisit your decision on the Friday. Now you can't take the 1800 because that's a peak train, so you need to wait for the 1900 train. So now your choice of fare on Sunday is now not only changing your decision on the fare on Friday, it's changing the train you're taking. Also explains why the 1800 goes out with empty seats and the 1900, the first off-peak train, goes out loaded to the gunnels. So choosing your train ticket online on websites is like trying to solve a quadratic equation. We would not have this fare structure if we were designing a fare structure that could be sold, that could be presented easily and simply online, and allowing people to make a simple choice and understand what they were choosing. That's the critical thing.
But on the flip side of that, you look at at the time of privatisation, 800 million passenger journeys on the railways. Just before the pandemic in 2020, 1.6 billion or whatever it is. And some people say, oh yes, that would have happened anyway. That was economic growth or whatever. I'm not convinced by that. I still believe that the fares structure, however complicated it's become, has helped drive that growth. Is that fair? Or, so have we ended up with something that worked to an extent but has become really complex in the process? Is that what we're saying?
There were at least two major factors on the railway side that have driven the doubling of passenger numbers since privatisation. And the first, as you say, was pricing. The intercity operators have almost all invested in airline-style yield management systems to literally price people onto the trains, to fill capacity. And even when I was at DfT in the sort of early 2000s, we were seeing the average fare paid on the West Coast Main Line actually fall. And now the media were all going on about how the the fully flexible fare, the anytime fare, was going up. But this is basically a business fare. It's bought by people on expense accounts. It's only bought by sort of 10-15% of people, and that was back then. It's probably less now. The extra cheap advanced purchase fares were getting more people onto the rails, and the overall effect of that was to drive down the average fare. And it's just a shame that that didn't come through in the media. The other thing, of course, that happened with privatisation was that operators all discovered that they couldn't make money by driving down costs, because rail track access costs are pretty much fixed. Rolling stock leasing, you can't do much about that. What you can do is increase revenue. And the best way, a surefire way of increasing revenue, is to increase service frequency. So we've seen services on key, usually intercity routes, double from typically hourly under BR to half hourly now. Routes like London to Ipswich and Norwich, London to Cardiff, London to Bristol, Manchester, of course, an unprecedented 3 trains an hour. That frequency has helped drive the extra business. And I think RDG, Rail Development Group, did try and get some analysts to put a number on what part of this doubling of passenger numbers was down to the rail industry and what was down to external factors. And the number they come up with is about, from memory, about 60%. So 60% of the doubling, if you like, is the frequency and the pricing and the things that the industry has done.
That's amazing.
It absolutely is. I remember having conversations with Christopher Garnett in GNER days, and Christopher was of the view, he said, if we get the frequency right so that people don't look at the timetable anymore, they just turn up for a train, we're really winning. And of course Virgin did that big time with the 3 trains an hour on the west coast. It was almost a metro frequency. You just turned up, there's another train every sort of 20 minutes. So where do we find ourselves today? Well, Grant Shapps said that the numbers of people travelling by train had been decimated, and I seem to recall seeing the TV interview where he answered the question. He said, I'll answer that in one word: coronavirus, which Richard and I agree is just total nonsense. I think in due course, when we take the long view, which of course this government and very few governments do, is it will be revealed as a blip. Sure, a big one, but a blip nonetheless. You know, we've got commuters back to 80%, that leisure services up to about 130%, and I do think it will creep back. You know, but we talk endlessly about reforming the fare system, but how will we go about that, Mark? Is there an ideal model? Because the Treasury have been fairly implacably opposed to fare reform over the years because they're neurotic that the law of unintended consequences will drive the revenues down. Politicians are neurotic about the fact that where you've got winners, you've got losers, and that losers vote. So with politicians on the one hand and the Treasury on the other standing in the way of fares reform, it's a heck of a tough nut to crack. Perfect recipe for paralysis, Mark. So what do we do?
To be honest, fares reform has massive commercial potential, potential for kickstarting growth. The current fare structure is a mess. It's lost consumer trust and confidence. You couldn't have designed a better system to be difficult to sell online and on ticket machines, and this is the age where that is the critical factor. It's got to be understandable, it's got to be simple, and it's not. So, huge opportunity. There is remarkable agreement across the industry on what it should look like. It should all be one way. There should be just a choice of 3 fares, for example, for any given train for your outward journey, a fully flexible one anytime, a semi-flexible one off-peak, and a cheap inflexible one, advance, and a similar completely independent choice for your way back. And of course that also means that circular journeys and open jaw journeys are no longer penalised. There is not only a huge penalty under the current system for people going one way, there's a penalty for going up to Newcastle, walking Hadrian's Wall and coming back from Carlisle. It can cost almost twice as much as going to Newcastle and back. So a huge benefit if we can get a simple fare structure that can be presented online, easy to sell, easy to buy.
So there's a huge commercial opportunity.
There is.
There's remarkable consensus in what needs to be done. You've got the plan. It seems like we have to try very hard not to do the right thing, but somehow we do.
Well, I think there's 2 issues here. The first, of course, is the normal political one. the people who if you are going to change fares on a revenue neutral basis, which you'll have to do if you don't want it to cost billions, some fares will go up and other fares will come down. That's basically what change means. And we know from experience that the winners keep stum and the losers scream blue murder. So there is a natural reluctance to go down that road. So if you go down that road, I think we should, but we're going to have an absolutely clear communication plan saying this is what we're doing, this is why, this is what's going to happen. The second issue, perhaps more fundamental, is that the Treasury is extremely worried about what will happen to revenue if you play around with fare structures and pricing. And those are two different things. Not only do we need to have a simpler fare structure, we actually need to take the mess that is the current pricing structure, start from a clean sheet of paper and price the railway sensibly and consistently and get rid of this situation where the opportunities for split ticketing are absolutely endemic. Now, there's something called the Passenger Demand Forecasting Handbook, which is based on decades of experience since BR, and it'll tell you pretty accurately what happens if you take an existing fare and increase it or decrease it by 3% or 2% or 5%. That's a known quantity. It won't tell you what will happen if you rip up the fare structure and the pricing structure and start again and do something completely different. That becomes far less predictable. And I can understand a concern on the part of the Treasury that this could jeopardise a huge part of the £10 billion that comes in. Yeah. Now, my answer to that is quite simple. If you don't know what the answer will be, but you give it your best shot with a new fare structure and a new pricing structure that is aimed at revenue neutrality. You won't hit the bullseye on day one, but you'll know fairly quickly whether you've undershot or overshot. One of the industry systems is Lennon, latest earnings network nationally overnight. The clue is in the name. You'll know within 48 hours whether you've undershot or overshot. They're your fares. They're fares that the industry control. If you get it wrong, you can change them next week. So you would have a initial adjustment after a short period. The elasticity effects would take a little bit longer to work their way out, so you probably have a wash up in a few months. After that, you would hope that the simplicity, the ease of selling online actually starts to grow revenue and make the railways easier to use and attract more users. Or if you like, remove a current barrier to rail use, the complexity of the fare structure.
That's a perfect example, Mark, of one of my favourite expressions about zigzagging your way to success.
It's a really interesting point about this kickstarting growth. I mean, there'll be a lot of debate over the next few weeks of whose ideas this all is and who's trying to drive it, who's trying to lead it. But the one thing we're absolutely clear on at the moment is that there's just an attitude of it's cost reduction, right? And the problem is we've got to find a way of getting back to growth. And that is the key. That is absolutely the key.
Yeah, entirely.
Well, Mark did say then, didn't he, that there's a real commercial advantage to be had from fares reform, but nobody's seizing it. What is wrong with them? Well, how long have you got?
Yeah. But the other thing that you mentioned there, at the part of that, Mark, was the fact that we have seen a change in buying habits. So, I remember back at the start of privatisation, and you may well sort of say, well, actually it started prior to that even, but we saw vending machines, we saw online purchases. I mean, we buy everything online now, right? I mean, it's kind of part and parcel of a life. I think I saw some stat that said something like 90% of tickets are now bought online rather than a ticket office. Well, that does suggest that even when you've sorted out the fare structure, there is an argument for ticket office reform. I mean, that is fair, isn't it?
Yes, there is. But not like this, or not like the proposals that have just been canned. Right. After you reform fares, making them simpler so you reduce the demand on your ticket offices, you also need to look at those processes that currently have to be done at a ticket office but could be done online. So, for example, warrants that need to be that are used to pay for certain tickets can only be used at a ticket office. Rail vouchers, compensation vouchers, well, it's perfectly possible to have an e-voucher that you can use online, but that's not the way rail vouchers work. Seat reservations to go with an existing ticket. At the moment, if you've got an Avanti West Coast ticket from London to Manchester and you want a reservation on a different train, there is a way to make it online. There's a very well hidden page on the GWR website, gwr.com, that will make standalone seat reservations. How are you supposed to know that? So the next thing you would do is sort out processes for all these things that at the moment drive people to ticket offices, when many people would find it more convenient doing it at home. So that's the next thing you would do. And then you would assess your ticket office requirements in a consistent way. You probably come up with a national retailing proposition, something that was consistent across the country. These proposals had Avanti West Coast closing the ticket office at Glasgow and Euston, but 200 yards down the road at King's Cross, LNER was going to keep King's Cross open. Edinburgh was going to stay open, so was Newcastle. That was incredibly inconsistent. You would probably do it in a much more sensible way by looking at station categorisation. So the biggest stations, the category A, category B, you would keep a ticket office. And maybe you would do away with the ticket window that makes communication difficult. You'd have an open counter. People prefer that. Then at smaller stations, you'd look at your provision and whether you still needed a ticket office there. I mean, some very small stations, where all they knock out is cheap day returns to London, that's actually perhaps an easier issue to look at. But you would do it on a logical and consistent basis across the country.
Oh, the example of King's Cross open, Euston closed, Edinburgh open, Glasgow closed, I agree. That is just nonsensical by any measure by any measure. So, yeah.
And like New Street was going to be a closure, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
How can that ever make sense?
So, sorry, no, please. Go on.
I was going to say that there is always a lot of business at the larger stations because you've got all this intercity seat reservation, bike reservations going on as well. And if we look abroad, other train companies across Europe are grappling with the same issue. None of them have gone quite as far as Swedish Railways, SJ, who have done away with ticket offices completely. And I went to Stockholm Central because I couldn't quite believe that they'd done this. On the first day I went, there was a person wandering about helping people use machines. The second day, there was no one, there was nothing. If you had a problem with ticketing, there was nobody to help, and that is far too far. Then across the Baltic, you've got the Finnish. They've taken a different view. Helsinki still has a ticket office, but that great big hall that used to be the ticket hall is now an Italian restaurant, and they've got a ticket office that's smaller, that's got open counters, and is much closer aligned to the sort of more complex transactions and the volume of transactions that they now do. But they've still got one, and that's a much more sensible approach.
Have we got any idea of what SJ Swedish Railways have seen in terms of their income change as a result of what sounds quite a brutal approach?
I don't think they tell us if they lost lots of money.
I think you're probably right.
But that is certainly a risk of the current proposals. DfT did not seem to take any account of the potential for revenue loss from closing all these ticket offices. When you've got offices still taking a sizable chunk of money and you take them away, well, you hope that money reappears in ticket machines or through the internet, but of course it was highly likely that a lot of that money was going to disappear. And it's another symptom of the problem that we've got. DfT has cost risk, and were worried about the cost of ticket offices. They didn't have to worry if it lost any money by closing them, because the money goes to the Treasury, and that's the Treasury's problem. So that's not a good way to run a business, keeping revenue and costs separate. Certainly not a good way to run a railway, but not any sort of business.
One of the big sort of criticisms by people who were opposed to the ticket office closures, you frequently heard it was all about, TOCs would lose profits, and that's why they were safeguarding profits by shutting ticket offices. But that's a nonsense, isn't it, Mark? They'd actually lose money, wouldn't they, if they shut
Technically,
the ticket offices?
they would. That's absolutely right. We now have a nationalised railway that still looks privatised because the government pay all the costs of running the railway. Whatever a train company incurs running the trains up and down and keeping the ticket offices open, the government pay that with a 2% management fee on top. And the fares revenue, when you buy a ticket, the money doesn't go to the train company, it goes to the Treasury. So by closing the ticket office, the organisation that was going to save all the money, save all the cost, isn't the train operator, it's DfT. If anything, the train company was going to lose the 2% that it get paid on top for running the ticket offices. Not an amount of money that they were enough to worry them, but technically, in principle, the profits actually go down, not up.
And that's one of the reasons why it was such a madness to suggest that the Toks were coming up with this as their idea, because it would have harmed their finances. It really does point the finger back at the DfT, because they're the ones who would have got the savings.
What is it you have to look for? Motive, opportunity and means? Well, the motive is definitely DfT's.
Well, there you go. You've talked about other countries, Mark, and so that's of interest. But so kind of to sum this up, what's the, if you were at the, and just as a side issue, does anybody at the DfT or the Treasury, has anybody ever had this conversation with you and said, look, Mark, talk us through this? You know, we said you're the expert's expert, and I know that makes you feel a bit uncomfortable, but it's true. Do they? I mean, have they not sort of come to you and talked to you about this and said, well, talk us through?
Not so far.
Really? So they didn't consult John Armitt and TfL and various other people on shopping HS2. They haven't talked to you about this. There you go, Mark Harper, Hugh Merriman. Talk to Mark. He may well make your life easier and not put you in the position of having to either throw the rail industry under the bus or make fatuous excuses about things that were your idea in the first place. So what would you do if you had the old magic wand question, Mark? You've got the magic wand. What would you do tomorrow if you could institute change to set this process off on the right track in a significant manner?
We need to put management back into the railways. National, cohesive, coherent, commercial, 3 C's, commercial management. So we need BR 2.0, or Great British Railways, or a strategic rail authority, whatever you want to call it. It needs to be created. There's a lot that could be done without legislation, but really, to make it properly effective, I understand that legislation has to go through. So that ought to be a priority, because at the moment, train companies are just contractors. It's no longer their business carrying passengers for money. That responsibility for an £11 billion business sits with the DfT, and government departments are simply not designed to run businesses. It needs a separate organisation, commercially minded, arm's length from government, bringing together revenue and cost in one place. Once
Back
you've got
in
that,
February, sorry, go on.
I say once you've got
No, go
that,
on.
then I think we need to reform fares. Then we need to look at the ticket processes, and then if there is, once we've got those out of the way, then if you want to look at adjusting your ticket office provision in the light of how things have gone, then you can do it at that stage.
So there you go, Mark. Hugh, that's the thing to do. You could even claim it was your idea if you like. Back in February, the Secretary of State at the Bradshaw lecture came up with this expression that it was time to let managing directors both manage and direct, and I think that's what you've just said. Interestingly, that in the 8-9 months since then, he's done absolutely nothing to make that happen. Richard, you were once, I nearly said you were once a string puller. You were once in a position where you had your hands on the levers. Any further thoughts from you on this and what we should do next?
I'd just build on what Mark just said there about commercial, cohesive management, and I absolutely agree. I mean, what's going to happen now is there will be a fight over whose idea this was and who said what to who and all the rest of it, none of which matters a row of beans, because what matters is that there's a culture now, and it's a culture set by government that is all about cost reduction. It's not about growth, and that is a fundamental issue. And really, for ministers to do what they have done, said, "Oh, it's not really anything to do with us." Whoever started it, that's not acceptable. And this is a climb down. You can't put it any other way. This is a climb down. For me, it provides irrefutable evidence, if any was needed, that the 20-year experiment that started with the abolishment of the SRA in 2004 to bring increasing micromanagement of the railway into the heart of government has failed. It has utterly failed, right? Government ministers, civil servants of all political persuasions, so Labour, take note, they've got neither the skills nor the experience to make the correct operational, practical, or as it turns out, even customer-facing decisions. We do not need public or private control. We need professional control, and we need to bring that back. We've just about got enough competent, experienced railway professionals to turn this around, but only if we act now. So nearly 700,000 people have shown what happens when they rise up and say, no, enough, right? And they have given the government a bloody nose with this, and rightly so. And as you said, well done, Transport Focus. But now is the time for the industry to grow a spine, right? We need to stop the sycophantic parroting of the latest number 10 or Department for Transport line to take and say and do what is right.
I think that's absolutely right, Richard. We haven't got into it at the minute, but I've got a page here from the Rail Delivery Group, 3/4 of which is a paean to what they'd done right about this. We pledged this, we pledged that, we pledged that. But it was all a failure. And you get to the bottom, and this is from Jack Starr, the RDG Chief Executive. While these plans won't now be taken forward, we will continue to look at other ways to improve passenger experience while delivering value for the taxpayer.
Yeah, it's your job to worry about delivering for your customers. It's other people's job to worry about the taxpayer, right? The job of rail professionals is to run it effectively, make it deliver and grow it. That's where the focus should be.
You made another comment then about professionalism. I mean, two things about that. Throughout my 28 years as a railway journalist, a characteristic throughout was senior railway managers saying to me, oh, you're saying all the right things in your editorials and your comments and all that. You're saying the sort of things that we can't. Well, why can't they? And now is the time, I think, for them, as you said, to grow a spine, I think. Yeah. And to actually speak up for that professionalism, for what's right. Otherwise, if you don't set the agenda, somebody else will. And as you've just said, for 20-odd years, it's been the DfT and civil servants and all the rest of it. Just before we wrap up, Mark, and on the subject of professionalism, your knowledge is just astonishing. And I think both Richard and I have learned lots just listening today. So thanks for that. But just give us a quick insight into, if you like, your professional background. I mentioned at the head of the programme you were a station manager. You were responsible for some quite big stations, so you do know what you're talking about.
Well, I started off in my first position looking after some lovely small stations down in Kent. So the Mardens and Staplehursts and Rye, Sussex, Ham Street, Appledore, lovely places. And unbelievably, in my first job, station manager was a jack of all trades. I'd go into the signal box, have a cup of tea with the signalman, sign the train register, check the emergency equipment. Then I'd walk across the level crossing to the ticket office and go through the ticket office accounts with the booking clerk. Can you imagine that happening now? Just it's two different companies. So yes, later on, I was station manager at Charing Cross, London Bridge, Cannon Street. Very different up in London. All the human life is there. And from being a jack of all trades, I ended up, cutting a long story short, at the Department for Transport as head of the fares and ticketing team. So from jack of all trades to a specialist in what I think a lot of people, government included, regard as a black art.
Also, Charing Cross, London Bridge and Cannon Street. Anybody sitting out there thinking, what does he know? The answer is a lot. And thank you for making your expertise available to us, Mark. That was an absolutely brilliant, masterful contribution. And I hope this is the first of many appearances on Green Signals, educating Richard and I as to the real facts of the matter. And it's great to hear it from you direct, from the horse's mouth. Makes a real difference. What do you think, Richard?
Absolutely, that has been superb. And listen, we've had conversations about fares before, but it never gets dull or boring as a subject. And yeah, absolutely terrific. So I really appreciate it. Thank you, Mark.
Thanks ever so much, Mark. And we hope to see you again soon.
Thank you.
Wow. How do you follow that? Well, the answer is with something a bit lighter-hearted and a bit easier and a bit more fun. Let's clear the decks from episode 3. We had some brilliant comments on YouTube about show 3, including from the Crofter, 1956, who made an interesting, although highly techie, critical point about 25 kV harmonic dampers. No, I don't know what that means either. Being required on the West Coast Main Line in the upgrade, seemingly taking Richard to task because they'd been missed off the Virgin Pendolinos. So, what say you, Richard?
Yeah, yeah, it was. It is quite a technical point. I said to the person who asked the question, I said I don't actually recall this. But what I do recall is that when we specified the trains and when we agreed the contract with Railtrack Pug 2, in that there's a schedule. It's something like the track train interface spec or the train track interface. I can never remember, but it's TTIS. What it does is it says, it was our way of saying to Railtrack, you've got to tell us what constraints we need to put on our train with our manufacturers and designers. You have to list them all out. If you put it in the list, we will make sure the train complies with all of that. But if you don't put it in the list, then that's on you. I can't recall that point being in the spec. But I'm now going to go and find my copy of Pug 2 and find out. And I will come back on it because I just don't remember it. But there was a spec there, and if we were meant to do them, it should have been there.
So you asked Railtrack, what do you want on this train? And if they didn't put it in the list, it didn't get put on.
Or it had to be retrofitted later at their expense, correct?
Which sounds like what had to happen. Okay, right. We also asked in the last episode about your favourite railway journeys. And Hugh Carr, now a regular and very welcome green signaller, said a favourite of his was Doncaster to Lincoln. Great line. Brilliant. Like many of us, Hugh reminisced about the long-gone semaphore signals, loose couple freight trains, guards' vans of his youth, all of the sort of stuff which Richard and I also grew up with in industrial Lancashire and which gave the railway such a lot of character. We all thought that classic railway landscape and its traffic would last forever. Then at great speed, it was gone, along with much permanent wear that we rapidly discovered to our horror was anything but. So please let us know your favourite train trips and we'll read out the best ones. Give people an excuse to go and maybe learn about those railways. They don't have to be dramatic or routes of considerable scenic beauty. Don't forget that Richard's first one was Chorley to Manchester Victoria, which I don't think Michael Portillo's done just yet.
Oh, I think that was scenic beauty. I don't know,
Okay, well, eye of the beholder and all that.
Indeed.
They only have to be a journey that means something special to you because they're the best ones anyway. And don't forget, check out our website where we put additional material following last week's show in the blog. And there's some great photos and actually a really interesting video about tunnelling at Farnworth, which you don't often hear about. That's well worth the watch.
It is well worth the watch, that actually. It was the one I was talking about last week where they had to fill it and then bore it out again. The other thing to say, Nigel, is we got mentioned in Parliament. That was the other thing that happened after, I think it was the show before, but we got mentioned in Parliament thanks to a question asked by the influential chair of the Transport Select Committee, Ian Stewart, who asked in Transport Questions, he asked the Secretary of State for Transport, Mark Harper, to comment on the thing that we said in episode 2 of Green Signals, that released capacity on the existing network, what we call the classic network, when HS2 was built, had not been valued in the business case. And Mark Harper said the phase 1, so that's the phase 1 of HS2, benefit cost ratio for HS2 captured some of the benefits of released capacity, including new demand for existing services. It did not include all the benefits from new services, which is exactly what we said. So good to have that confirmed by the Secretary of State.
Some was a key word there, and he could have just said green signals was correct, but being a politician, he didn't. So that's about it for this issue of the programme, and which has been fascinating to do, and a real sort of comment on the speed and technology of the podcast. We're doing things which means we've been able to record this programme within 6 hours of the Secretary of State making his comments that the station ticket officers closure programme was being abandoned. So, thanks for listening, as usual. Don't forget to like, follow, subscribe on podcast platforms and, of course, on YouTube. If you'd rather sit and watch Richard and I doing this, which, of course, I appreciate is a thing of joy for all of you that choose to do that. And listen out for next week's show, where we hope to have another very well-known guest. We don't know what it's going to be or who the guest will be, because we always make sure that the subject matter we cover is absolutely topical, as I think we've proved today. Thanks once again for Mark Smith for joining us. How brilliant was he?
Superb. Absolutely superb.
Wasn't he just? It's always great to hear a real expert talking with authority and simplicity about some really complicated things. And the thing, my takeaway from all that, Richard, is that, we've talked about fares reform for ages. It seems incredibly difficult, but Mark says we could do this. It's quite simple, and there's remarkable consensus on it. So we just should get on with it, really, shouldn't we? JFDI, as they say. I won't fill it out in full. But how brilliant was Mark? But for now, from Richard and me, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.